McDonnell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll be brief. The debate has roamed over more than just the fiscal rule and the welfare cap, and I won't tread in some parts of the debate so far, apart from say my friend from Wolverhampton East on the front bench, I think, has demonstrated the economic and political farce of a government that we now have. There was much the Honourable Member for Woking made in terms of the points about the role of the Bank of England debt. I thought that was an interesting to pursue in another debate at a later time. And the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central, I think, quite pertinently drew attention to the iniquitous nature of the welfare cap. Can I say to the Honourable Member for Herefordshire, Bedfordshire, sorry, my eyesight's going at the moment, Bedfordshire West, I thought his contribution was interesting, but I felt his definition of Parliament's role as the protection of property is something of a 17th century view of the nature of democracy that we might want to debate elsewhere. I just want to get on the record a few sentences about the welfare cap. I go back to the debates that we had during the banking crash, when there was an understanding, a popular understanding of the causes of that crash, which was the way the system was operated as a result of greed, the incompetence from the finance sector, alongside that greed. In addition to that, the mismanagement of regulation of finance over decades. There's a big argument put at the time and subsequently by the parties opposite about we were in a weaker position with regard to because of our deficit at that point in time of the crash. I think it's a very feeble argument, but there is some substance to it, and I had some argument at the time that the reason there was that deficit is because we didn't have an adequate taxation policy which matched our expenditure overall. But that was for another time. But I say to the Honourable Member for Herefordshire, I can remember George Osborne ripping into Gordon Brown and others when even the concept of a fiscal rule was raised, and the attacks that George Osborne then made on the ludicrous nature of a fiscal rule that no one would ever abide by, and there would be no sanctions. So that when he was elected, appointed Chancellor in 2010 under the Coalition and brought forward the whole proposal of the fiscal rule process, some of us thought it was ripe, to say the least. However, the most iniquitous bit about that debate, I think, was the combination of the introduction of the individual benefits cap as well as the overall welfare cap. The individual benefits cap, I think, is egregious, and it has forced people into poverty and hardship, and in many of our areas impacted upon their mental health in a way which has pushed many of them over the edge, and some into even taking their own lives. That's the tragedy of that element of the cap. But the welfare cap itself, the overall welfare cap, is part of that political direction. The point has been made time and time again that austerity was a political choice. It wasn't an economic necessity. And part of that political choice as well was the introduction of the cap. After austerity was introduced, people woke up to the fact that public services were being cut on a scale that they'd not seen before. It was impacted upon the health service, education, local council expenditure, and in addition to that, there were pay freezes, and in the end, because of inflation, pay cuts. And there was a reaction against that, an understandable reaction. I can remember the deep unpopularity of the coalition government in that early stages. And I think there was a cynical decision made. Well, I know there was a cynical decision made because Lord Freud, who was responsible for welfare policy and supposed welfare reform, has exposed in these recent months that there was a cynical decision made. And it wasn't on the basis of reform of welfare, it wasn't on the basis of economic management, it was to find a scapegoat. And that scapegoat, unfortunately chosen by the then coalition government, were the poorest in our society, the unemployed, the people with disabilities, and tragically children as well. I remember the language that was used, and I have to say as well, permeated many sides of this House too. Strivers as against skivers. I can remember the tales of the twitching curtain where some would stay in bed while others went to work, etc. It certainly didn't reflect what was happening in my constituency, because everyone I came up against were desperate for a job, but more importantly were desperate for a job that paid a wage that would keep a roof over their heads and put food on their table for their children. That's where the welfare cap came in. And it became, of all other expenditure, this is the area of expenditure that had to be capped in some form. And other areas of expenditure that were equally demand-led weren't debated. It was specifically because there had to be a scapegoat found. And you know, we went back to the attitudes of almost the poor law and the workhouse. I remember those debates. I was offended by them. I was made angry by them. But above all else, I was shamed by them that this House could stoop to that level. And that's what happened, and people suffered as a result. So this welfare cap in this report associated with the fiscal rule is a base anachronism that should no longer exist. But I fear this, for as long as it exists, if as we go through this period where the economic pressures will impact upon any government, but also on as has been said, the cost of living crisis is easy to say as a phrase, but actually there's a reality to it, because it's already causing hardship in many of our constituencies. If as we go through that, I believe this government will want to find another scapegoat, and it will be the poor again. It will be the disabled. It will be those who can't find a job or who can't get enough hours in a job to keep them out of poverty. And they'll use the same mechanisms, and the welfare cap will be part of it as long as it remains in some form of statutory form. That's why tonight I will be voting against the welfare cap, because in principle I think it's an appalling piece of legislation. I think it's proved to be inhumane in its impact, but in addition to that, I think it will be a tool that will be used and a weapon that will be picked up again to attack working class people that I represent. And that's why I want on the record tonight why I oppose it and will continue to oppose it until we hopefully secure a government that will throw out this abysmal piece of political weaponry against working class people.